If you want to know how any event or policy will affect the economy, you must think first about how it will affect supply and demand. This chapter introduces the theory of supply and demand. It considers how buyers and sellers behave and how they interact. It shows how supply and demand determine prices in the market economy and how prices in turn allocate the economy's scarce resources. The terms supply and demand refer to the behavior of people as they interact with one another in competitive markets. A market is a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good and services. The buyers as a group determine the demand for the product, and the sellers as a group determine the supply of the product. Markets take many forms. Some markets are highly organized, such as markets of agricultural commodities like wheat and corn. In these markets, buyers and sellers meet at a specific time and place. Most markets in the economy are highly competitive. Each buyer knows that there are several sellers from which to choose, and each seller is aware that his product is similar to that offered by other sellers. Price and quantity are determined by all buyers and all sellers as they interact in the marketplace. A competitive, a competitive market is a market in which there are so many buyers and so many sellers that each has a negligible impact on the market. In this chapter, we assume that markets are perfectly competitive. To reach this highest form of competition, the markets must have two characteristics. The goods offered for sale are all exactly the same, and buyers and sellers are so numerous that no single buyer or seller has influence over the market. Buyers and sellers in perfectly competitive markets must accept the price the market determines. They are said to be price takers. Not all goods and services, however, are sold in perfectly competitive markets. Some markets have only one seller, and this seller sets the price. And such a market is called a monopoly. Demand is the behavior of buyers. The quantity demanded of any good is the amount of the good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. The law of demand claims that, other things being equal, the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of the good rises. The market demand is the sum of all individual demands for a particular good or service. The quantity demanded in a market is the sum of the quantities demanded by all buyers at each price. The market demand curve is found by adding all the individual demand curves together. Any change that increases the quantity demanded at every price shifts the demand curve to the right and is called an increase in demand. Any change that reduces the quantity demanded at every price shifts the demand curve to the left and is called a decrease in demand. What causes shifts in the demand curve? Income, price of related goods, taste, expectations, or number of buyers. If the demand for a good falls when income falls, the good is called a normal good. If the demand for a good rises when income falls, the good is called an inferior good. Goods for which an increase in the price leads to an increase in the demand for another is called a substitute. When the demand for one good reduces the demand for another good, the two goods are called substitutes. Substitutes are often pairs of goods that are used in place of each other, such as hot dogs and hamburgers, sweaters and sweatshirts, and movie tickets and film streaming services. Two goods for which an increase in the price of one leads to a decrease in the demand for the other are called complements. Perhaps the most obvious determinant of your demand for any good or service is your taste. Your expectations about the future may affect your demand for a good or service today. And in addition to all these other factors, market demand depends on the number of these buyers. Let's look at a case study of two ways to reduce smoking. One way to reduce smoking is to shift the demand curve for cigarettes and other tobacco products. Public service announcements, mandatory health warnings on cigarette packages, and the prohibition of cigarette advertising on television are all policies aimed at reducing the quantity of cigarettes demanded at any price. If successful, these policies shift the demand curve to the left. Second way, policymakers can try to raise the price of cigarettes. If the government taxes the manufacture of cigarettes, for example, cigarette companies must pass the tax on to consumers in the form of higher prices. The higher price encourages smokers to reduce the number of cigarettes they smoke. In this case, the reduced amount of smoking does not represent a shift in the demand curve. Instead, it represents a movement along the demand curve to a point with a higher price and lower quantity demanded. Supply. The quantity supplied of any goods or service is the amount that sellers are willing and able to sell. The relationship between price and quantity is called the law of supply. All the things being equal, when the price of the good rises, the quantity supplied also rises. When the quantity falls, the quantity supplied falls as well. Law of supply claims that, other things being equal, the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises. Market supply is the sum of the supplies of all sellers. What causes shifts in the supply curve? Input prices, technology, expectations, and the number of sellers. Any change that raises the quantity supplied at every price, such as a fall in the price of sugar, shifts the supply curve to the right and is called an increase in supply. Input prices. To produce their output, sellers use various inputs. When the price of the inputs rises, production becomes less profitable. Thus, the supply of a good is negatively related to prices of the inputs used to make the goods. Technology. Technology for turning inputs into ice cream, for example, is another determinant of supply. Expectations. The amount, for example, ice cream a firm supplies today may depend on its expectations about the future. The number of sellers. In addition to these preceding factors, which influences the behavior of sellers, market supply depends on the number of these sellers. Keep in mind that a curve shifts only when there is a change in the relevant variable that is not named on the either axis. The price is on the vertical axis, so a change in price represents a movement along the supply curve. By contrast, because inputs, technology, expectations, and the number of sellers are not measured on either axis, a change in one of these variables shifts the supply curve. And same with demand. Income, price of related goods, taste, expectations, and number of buyers are not measured on either axis, so a change in one of these factors causes a shift in the demand curve. Supply and demand together. The point is called equilibrium when one point in which supply and demand curves intersect. This point is called the market's equilibrium. The price at this intersection is called the equilibrium price. The quantity is called the equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium is a situation in which the market price is reached the level at which the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Equilibrium price, the price that balances quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Equilibrium quantity, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at equal price. Equilibrium price is sometimes called the market clearing price because at this price, everyone in the market has been satisfied. Buyers have bought all they want to buy, and sellers have sold all they want to sell. The actions of buyers and sellers naturally move markets towards equilibrium of supply and demand. A surplus is a situation in which quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. A shortage is a situation in which the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. 3 steps to analyzing changes in equilibrium. Equilibrium price and quantity depend on positions of the supply and demand curves. When some event shifts one of these curves, the equilibrium in the market changes, resulting in a new price and a new quantity exchange between buyers and sellers. The law of supply and demand states that the price of any good adjusts to bring the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded of that good into balance.